that's showing us compared to that same customer with their traditional data set. So I think that, like I said, there's a long way to go, but we're starting to understand how those two relationships work with each other.
Thanks. So I think it's a really good segue also when we think about, I think about my own data that's in Uber or Grab, and I start to be concerned about who has availability, who has access to that kind of information. So the next question's for Angelo on that, in terms of how are individuals' privacy being protected in the search for these non-traditional data points, and what regulations, data security regulations, are in place. And are they appropriate for the markets to serve? Are they appropriate in these markets to serve these underserved customers?
Actually, this question is very interesting because it's like a kind of two-prong. You have data protection from a side of the one is actually in the market, like the players inside it, and then you have the overall arching regulations kind of governing all the players within that. So just on the data protections first, I think data protection, in a nutshell, it's like you could read all of the Data Privacy Act and the GDPR, but I think from a perspective of the customer, it's really start with informed consent. That you actually disclose to the customer what's the use of that data will be, and it will be exclusively used for the specific purpose that you're going to use it for. So really, it's just really informed consent, and then you don't go beyond that informed consent. So it starts with that. And then supplementing that, you need to make sure that your technology infrastructure can secure and encrypt your data collection storage. And lastly, it's just really investing in internal controls, compliance, and audit process internally. So I really see it like more of not just for fintechs, but also anyone engaged in a highly regulated activity. But for Tala, I think what's important to us is like we go beyond what's expected from the regulators. So for us, we actually advocated a strong data ethics and policy, that we are not complying for the sake of just complying it. It's really founded on the principles of ethical considerations, that we do know data is really subject to abuse, as we can see out today prevalently. And what will really set you apart as a good player in the market is really having that strict ethics and policies. So that keeps everyone in check, myself, our employees, our agents, our partners, our vendors. Everyone is within the data ecosystem is going to have that shared policy that ethical approach is also going to be the paramount consideration in treating data for the customer. So that's second level of the player. On the regulatory side, again, it's just be just within the because we're in the middle of like complying with all the new regulations fast changing. So I always see data protection in a market, especially in the Philippines, as coming to like I would say a crossroad, right? It's an inflection point. So as let's just call it out that there's like a lot of like really bad players lately in the market. So and this actually leads to a lot of like complaints from the customers. We have like questionable collection practices. We have some questionable advertising. So I really respect that a lot of the things that are being put in the adoption for the Data Privacy Act has to really adopt to what is happening in the market. Fintechs by nature, especially startups, are moving at a very rapid pace. So that's why the feedback loop with the regulators has to be intact so that these changes can be embedded in the new regulations. Or else, if there's no feedback loop, if that not is strong, you'll have two worlds, right, where you're just reacting. So you're going to have a very regulatory environment where it's very cramped and you're just reacting on what is the customer complaint of a very short-term nature. Or you'll have a more, I would say, a regulatory sandbox approach that I think this country is actually very, I think, good at adopting it. You have a test and learn approach where fintechs can actually exist in a world where they can actually test and have that learnings be factored in the future regulations that will promote a more open and inclusive technology startup. Because I think we are just going to the last question. I think one of the key essential requirements for really fostering the balance between data protection and really innovation as well is really finding that middle ground where players can push innovation but at the same time respecting consumer rights. So I do think this is going to be a very critical aspect again of the whole ecosystem in addition to the cash thing that I said earlier. So this is going to be a critical piece of regulatory innovation, if I would say.
And I have to go back to the informed consent piece because
Yes.
This is something that we see this screen on every single application on our phones that we're always informing. Do you find like how well do you think the customers are actually digesting the information? Do you think that they're actually reading that, and how do you have the confidence that they are really aware of the data that you're using?
So I cannot say how they're doing, but I can share just an example. So again, it's just related to what Simon's saying about the performance around NPL. We have seen that between good borrowers and bad borrowers, they've seen that one data point there is like with whether how much time psychometrics, like a psychometric data, they look at our app, they look at the terms and conditions. If someone's intending to defraud us and not to pay back, they don't really read it. Like, it really like 0.2 seconds or something. For good borrowers, they actually spend like a minute or 2 minutes just to read it intentionally, and then they submit and they apply. That's one data point across many things that they're doing within the app that we are actually seeing, and that's being validated by repayment behavior. So that's one. So I do think that could be a proxy for informed consent, because we can provide as much information, but at the end of the day, it's really also the responsibility of the borrower to really understand what what those terms and conditions are. And for the good borrowers, they're actually living up to the informed consent. But I guess it's going to be also like a partnership with the borrower and the lender as well.
And do you have any kind of, I guess, financial literacy to kind of guide
Yes.
them on that informed
Yes,
consent?
so that's why one of the strongest push right now, especially for us, is really what's beyond credit. Because credit should be viewed as something that's specific use case, right? For example, paying bills, or like how we use our credit card, but it's not meant to really solve everything in your life. So that's why I think one of the panels here discussing about insurance, because there are some certain expenses and emergencies that are the more suitable product is insurance. Unfortunately, at least for this market in the Philippines, we're not there yet. At least the proliferation of the product that's really out there is really microcredit. And then at the next year, I think these microinsurance products will come in. And then hopefully, like 2 years out, you'll see a convergence of these two products kind of helping each other to provide a more well-rounded solution to the customer.
So the whole suite of financial
It's
services.
well, that's where, I don't want to say a super app, but it's super, think of a super app for financial products. Sorry, I want to scratch that, but yeah. Yeah, but that's where I see it. It's like more integrated services customized to the data of the customer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I guess the next question is for Simona. If we're thinking about, this ecosystem, making sure that all these different organizations are working together and really supporting financial inclusion, just providing access to financial services, what infrastructure do you see is required to ease adoption of alternative lending platforms, and how can countries prepare to support ecosystems like this in the future?
Okay, so that's a very wide and interesting question. I think there's at least 3 areas that are under the control of the lenders, and 2 that are outside the control. All are very important. The 3 that are under the control of the lender are the scoring, okay, we saw it, so traditional and alternative, but also education, even in a more, I would say, specific sense for the borrower. So one of the areas where we saw some of our customer lender being successful against being less successful, it's really a kind of customer care or education where as soon as they lend the money, they actually call and explain that the money need to be repaid. Now, this seems to be very, very basic, but in disaster-hit countries like the Philippines, and it happened also in other countries here in Southeast Asia, it's not always so easy for the individual to distinguish between donor money that do not have to be repaid and borrowed money that instead have this obligation. So again, in general, of course, financial literacy is much more, but even as a single lender, to remind to the borrower that they actually have an obligation and repay. The other area that is also very important, make it easy to repay. The payment channel, and again, it seems very obvious, but here in the Philippines, till 2 years ago, when the BSP started the real-time payment network, the PesoNet, it was very, very difficult, and it's still not so easy to pay. It's really not so easy. So if you make it difficult for your borrower to repay the money, it doesn't only take the money, it doesn't only take the attitude, it's really, a thing they need to do and go through several times. So these are under the control of the lender. Now, 2 areas that are under the policies, I would say. One, it's surely, a national ID card. This is a project that the Philippines is going through, has been extremely successful, I would say, in China, and has been driving a lot of digital lending, even financial inclusion, because China has been very, very successful in, raising a lot of people out of poverty. So having a digital infrastructure that enable to identify the individual. There was a session yesterday on one-on-one digital identity. So I understand that everybody realizes how important it is. It has to be there. Another area that, again, it's outside the control, and in this case, I take a twist on the privacy. I believe that privacy is not only the consumer that have control of their data in terms of preventing for the data to be used, but on the opposite side, the consumer should be entitled for the data that he provided to be used for a certain purpose. And that's applied to government agencies. I mean, I have my birth certificate, so I want for my birth certificate to be accessible by the financial institution. I have maybe my tax return that are being filed. So if you're talking about SMEs and the ability to lend to SMEs, I work with, I don't know, whatever e-commerce platform. I want for my data that are hosted there to be available to others. This is a little bit on a twist on the privacy, but I think that it would really enable much more financial inclusion, actually a lot of other opportunities. A little bit what in Europe they are doing with the open API, right. That, you know, they broke the barriers and the resistance among the financial institutions.
No, and I can just see that being just, instead of trying to provide all these documents and you having to be the owner and the person who's maintaining them, to just provide that access and consent would do away with a lot of paperwork. It would do away with a lot of logistics and scanning, and I would see that being hugely key. Have you seen that, where have you seen, I mean, have you seen this model of people providing consent and being able to access the different systems, the different government agencies and things like that? Have you seen that applied anywhere?
So, I mean, I think that it is happening more in Europe right now, but again, it's because the regulation actually forced the institution that were holding those data to open up the data. Now, in Asia, again, we saw experience like, again, in China, where the government agencies that are holding data, they allow access for certain purposes, under control, and so on. Okay. Also in the Philippines, there are some agencies that are actually going in that direction. The LRA, the Land Registration Authority, did recently, I think together with ADB actually, a project on movable asset registry. So basically you can register for, again, for loans that are related to movable assets. So this is also, again, an initiative from a government agencies where the access will be open and regulated. But in general, no, I don't see that the Grab or Gojek or any, I mean, I don't want to say brands, but Lazadas and so on, they are forced to open, or the Facebook, I mean, you know that Facebook has a penetration in the Philippines that is outstanding. They are forced to open their data for usage under the consent, under the push of the data owner.
Right. Thank you, Simona. The last question before we go into the group question is for Dean Yoshino. How can financial institutions leverage these alternative scoring credit models to fulfill the credit gap specifically for MSMEs? And how do these models differ for this segment?
I think there are two groups of the SMEs. First one is startups, and another one is existing SME. And startups are very difficult for banks to lend because there is no data. That's why crowdfunding and hometown crowdfunding is important. Then for the existing SME, Japanese banks used to have a huge difficulty to lend money. And there is a joke in Japan. SME has 4 different accounts. First account is to show tax authority. Second account is to show bankers. Third account is his own account. Fourth account is to show to his wife. So those are the Japanese SME, and I heard it is very common in many Asian countries. That's why SME's data is not trustable. Then at the beginning, how could we collect the honest data from SME? So what we did in Japan was more than 70% of SME, when they borrow from bank, ask Credit Guarantee Corporation to guarantee certain percent of default. So we started to collect data from Credit Guarantee Corporation. So when the Credit Guarantee Corporation put guarantee to the borrowing to SME, they made sure you are showing honest data. Then once we started to collect huge amount of data, then we can see outliers very easily. Some of the SMEs are telling a lie. Then the data is not in this normal distribution. Then banks would ask, your data looks like something's wrong. Can you check it? Then they will bring next day the honest data. And that is a way, because big data set will allow us very easily to find out outliers. Then using those data, we have started to do scorings. There are three ways. One is profit model is very popular for the default risks. And we are also using cluster analysis and factor analysis to identify the different groups of SMEs. And the same method can be applied to National Credit Bureau, NCB in Thailand. Then the data confidentiality and so on. So when this Credit Guarantee Corporation start to put guarantee, then SME is easy to borrow money from banks. Then these Credit Guarantee Corporations will ask SME to allow to use their data as anonymous way, confidential way. So all the SME who are using this credit scoring, credit guarantee system has to agree. So that is a way to, in a sense, compulsory. So more than 70% of SME data is now available. Of course, all the company name has been erased, but it is possible to use those names. The only difficulty is the individual data. Individual data is not so easy. We have to ask each individual whether they allow us to use their data. So that's the difficulty which we are facing now. But Thailand National Credit Bureau has collected a huge amount of individual data and default, and anonymously they are using it. So probably that is a way for the government to force the individuals to disclose their data in anonymous, and confidentiality should be kept.
And by sharing all this data, then we're able to better understand the behavior of the consumers of the loans, so the consumers
Yes.
or the MSMEs, and then you're actually creating a score against the data that's been shared.
Yes, so there are two sets of data. One is business, small SME, MSME. Another one is individual data. Then we can classify those groups, very good individuals, very risky, and so on, and the same as in SME. And that will allow us to look at how much they have been changing from the good customer to the riskier, and so on. Then we can look at the data. Then banks start to examining those individuals much more carefully, and SMEs much more carefully. So that will help to reduce their default loans by banks.
Thank you, Dean Yoshino. The final question that I'll have all the panelists answer is what are the success factors for alternative lending platforms to thrive, specifically in the Southeast Asia market? Angela, you can start. You're furthest away.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I'll start. Okay. All right. I thought you were just making a...
I'm mixing it up.
Okay, got it. All right. I think for me, it's speaking from my own personal experience, I think we just need more entrepreneurs coming back in the region. And I've actually, so I was living in the US as I really came back for the fintech boom here in Southeast Asia. So so actually we need that. We need more entrepreneurs. We need more technical talent coming back to really solve. It's really a massive problem. I don't think it's like a fintech. Financial inclusion is something it's a word that's been thrown around so many times, but I don't think people really understand the gravity of how big that problem is. It's like 3-4 billion people, and it's like going to be a 66 trillion problem like in 5 years. So it's a massive problem that will take more than just one grab or go. It's just going to take the whole Southeast Asia to figure it out. Especially in the Philippines, you just need more people just jumping into the entrepreneurial hat and just go at it. Second is it's really more connected to like funding. Philippines is really lagging in terms of just having a share of like funding in terms of like VC investments in the country. I think we've just had two, it's like PayMaya and GCash, and some smaller startups here. But I haven't really seen like a really like sustainable flow of like investments made in the country. So that's really going to be one source. And I think it's really a function of more entrepreneurial talent coming back and technical talent. And lastly is really regulations. Regulations, it's going to be a critical. Like I would say, it's going to create an environment where where innovation can really thrive while protecting also consumer protection, consumer rights and data privacy. So that'll be like a very critical piece of also helping enabling at least the acceleration of innovation in this region.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. Yoshino?
Our hometown crowdfunding has started about 20 years ago in Japan. Now it is expanded to Peru, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And in all those cases, female startups do much better than men. That is the experience in this hometown crowdfunding. Because female always think about her own reputation. Men usually not. We go drinking at night. So that is a big difference. So trust is very important. A female borrowers wants to be successful in the community, and they work very hard. And this internet fintech company in Japan visit those startups quarterly basis. And if the business is not doing well, then they will ask, I don't know why, but my products are not selling very well, and so on. So this internet company will think together how to improve those businesses. Then quarterly basis. Then startup businesses are very easy to ask and get some advices. And lastly, I think that trust is very important in Asian regions because we cannot escape from the community. And this internet company, when they collect money from individuals, they post their photos, the owners of the shop or owners of the business. Then they advertise, I'm this kind of person, and I'd like to start these kind of businesses. So everybody who are contributing money knows who he is or who she is. And then the trust is very important. And if the products are very trustable and good, then repeated customer come to purchase those products. And then internet sales can be expanded all over Japan. And now recently it is sold to outside of Japan and in many Asian countries. The same can be applied to Cambodia, Vietnam, and Peru.
Thank you, Yoshino. Simona?
Yeah, I think that actually the situation now it's better than a few years ago. Again, there's more funding, there's more entrepreneurship in Southeast Asia and in the Philippines. So the things are actually improving. I guess they are improving across the regulation. I mean, the regulation framework are getting better, for example, in enabling crowdfunding, if not P2P, but again, alternative way to actually distribute than lending and wealth. And I see also this morning there were conversation about partnership between the banks that have large balance sheets and the finance company, the fintech company, to be their front end. So there can be maybe another way to, let the financing reach each part of the country. I guess that, again, we are still not completely there. Sometimes we also see government initiative by themselves in trying to directly go straight to the financing, so taking financial initiative. For example, here in the Philippines, we as CRIF would work with DTI on the entrepreneurship program. So there's a program from the government that is called P3 to distribute lending funds to micro-entrepreneurs. And again, basically DTI tied up with CRIF on the technology side, because at the end of the day, if you distribute very small amount of funds, then the operational cost can be so high, especially if it's a government institution. So bringing technology can also help to make it happen in a real way, I would say.
Thank you, Simona. Alison?
I think we actually need to take our blinkers off. So what do I mean by that? Think of a horse in a race. The Melbourne Cup was on yesterday in Melbourne, Australia, if anyone's from Melbourne. But those horses run a couple of minutes this race. They have their blinkers on. That's because they know the game that they're playing. But if you start to change the context of what those horses are racing in, the same way we talk about data and underwriting, the world is completely different. So I think we need to, probably a little bit to Yoshina's point around even like women entrepreneurs, like understanding and being a little bit more comfortable taking some risk that we may not have previously considered or played in. And the same with different data sources as well. I just think there's companies like Revolut. I don't know if anyone knows of Revolut, but there are, yeah, I've seen a few nods in the audience, great. So these companies are coming, and I was at a presentation the other day. Revolut was sitting on the main stage with the big banks, and the banks were looking nervous. They didn't say they were nervous, but they were looking nervous. Their physical bodies were nervous. And this is because these companies have low cost. They're not out there to make huge amounts of dollars. Regardless if you think that's right or wrong, I don't have an opinion, but that they say that. So if this is coming, which it is, we need to take our blinkers off and have a look at the world a little bit differently to figure out how we move forward together.
Thank you. So I do want to take time for questions. So and I'll share a summary of, I think, what the learnings that we just heard in terms of success factors. So I'll take the first and most popular question. It's just the glare. So there are many alternative credit score providers in the market these days: CRIF, FinScore, CredOLab, Experian, TransUnion, etc. How does a lender know which one to choose?
Ask the lender.
It's up to you.
So I'll answer it in two ways. So I had experience actually choosing a score when I was with Citibank, and then now as one with FinTech. So from this side, from a traditional perspective, I think it's the only way you can really do it is really test it. So you mix your own that score with your own proprietary data, and then you can have your own, I would say, custom scores, and you can do benchmark it, see if there's a lift in the performance, and then that's how you go about it. So we call it